Hey Pioneers, welcome to episode number 445. Today's episode is a fun one, bringing back a much beloved guest. And this episode is not only packed with ways to approach home butchery, especially of larger animals. So if you're actually like me, this is something that we have not done here on our homestead. In the episode, you'll hear me dive into why, but also Andrea's approach on how to do it, even if you don't have those, to not let it stop you, which I love. But I think what I actually enjoyed more about this conversation is the topic of villages and community. And it's really interesting because just this week, in a conversation that did not involve Andrea at all, this has come up. And it's surrounding that of being a community is probably a little bit more towards what we would speak of and know today, but it's really going back ancestral wise to what one would have had in your villages, which were communities. But kind of talking about that and how we've lost that for a large portion or a large part in today's society, especially even inside the homesteading niche, and where that's missing, how it affects us, because it truly does affect us both as homesteaders, but also as society. And that also of butchering and the act of raising livestock, harvesting livestock. You can use whatever word you want there: harvest, kill, slaughter, butcher. It all ends up being the same end result. But how being so far removed from that, the consequences of that, and also the way that Andrea and I view it and our experience with that, including that experience with our children. I think no matter where your stance is on it, just those portions alone, even if you're like, I'm probably never going to butcher my own meat, even if that's you, just the conversation around those things, the village, and the act of raising and being involved with this process, I highly encourage you to listen. Today's podcast episode is sponsored by Azure Standard. If you've hung out with me for any amount of time, you know that Azure Standard is a company near and dear to my heart and that I love. And this time of year, as we move into fall, is when not only a lot of butchering action takes place, because normally that's when temperatures start to cool enough, especially if hanging meat is something, if you live in an area where you're at or what you're doing. It's also hunting season for a lot of areas. And so naturally harvest and filling back up the larder, making sure your supplies are stocked, is something that we do in fall. This is a very seasonal thing for us. I have just been going through, it's when I always make sure I am stocked up on our staples, things like flour, salt, sugar, chocolate is a staple, as well as coffee, and our fat stores. If we are not butchering and I'm not replenishing my lard, I don't have a dairy animal at this moment. So with butter, those are things that I get from Azure Standard. I get butter and I freeze enough to take us through at least the winter, and getting our food organized and in 5-gallon buckets for our larger food store items. You can fit in a 5-gallon bucket with a gamma lid, which I get through Azure Standard, as well as the items that are going into it: a 25-pound bag of flour, 25-pound bag of rice, and a 25-pound bag of sugar. And actually, in the 5-gallon bucket, the 25-pound bag of sugar, you can fit more than 25 pounds. It's a little bit denser and thicker, so you can get more in. But if you were curious, well, how much of those items can I actually get in a 5-gallon bucket? That is how much you can get in. Having the gamma lids is great because if you need to access them, you can, but they screw down tight. They're going to keep pests out or in. If you were to get something inside the bucket, instead of infecting everything in the pantry, it would stay isolated. I use them more to make sure that I'm keeping pests out. They're also stackable. And if moisture is an issue, which hopefully not within your food storage, but if it is, they also are going to help keep moisture out of those items. And then I can also make sure that I'm rotating through them easily, not only for the supplies going in them, but also your storage supplies. Azure Standard is my go-to where I get all of those items. And if you are a first-time customer, use coupon code Melissa15. That's Melissa15 for 15, and you'll get 15% off your first order of $100 or more as a first-time customer. Okay, now on to my conversation with Andrea. Well, hey, Andrea, welcome back to the Pioneering Today podcast.
Hey, Melissa, it's so cool to be here. I'm so excited. I heard from so many people who said either they heard me on your podcast and that's how they found our podcast, or they heard you on my podcast and that's how they found your podcast. So it seems like we have a lot of good crossover with our listeners.
Yeah. Well, I don't know about you. Like, I never read just like one author. I never listen to just one podcast. So when I find one that resonates with me, I'm like, yes, I have another one to add in.
Yeah.
Well,
it's nice to have some variety.
It is. And I have been waiting for this episode because one, I think it's a topic that not as many people are familiar with or probably have a little bit more hesitancy about. So I'm just really excited to kind of open this up. And I mean, the topic of home butchery, but when we're talking about larger animals, like there's a lot on poultry butchering. Yeah. We do poultry butchering and even pig butchering. But when you get to cattle, I feel like that's a really big spot for homesteaders that you just don't see done a whole lot. So first up, like, let's just talk about why butchering large animals at home. And I mean, there's kind of like obvious answers. So like you have control over it, that it's not something you're sourcing out, but like, let's kind of just like talk about that. Why would we want to do that? Yeah.
Okay. So why butcher large animals at home? So I feel like I want to even go a little bit farther back to the way we butcher large animals, because we're still in that middle, that the whole thing that I want to share with people is the idea that you can kind of butcher them at home, but also not, if that makes sense. So that's where I feel like the perks come in for the small homestead. So if you're set up to butcher large animals, then you know it. You obviously know it. That's something you do. But if you've ever done chickens, I'm talking to you. You know what I mean? Like that's okay, I've done chickens or rabbits or opossums or whatever people are eating these days. And what if you want to, you've got, an Angus out in your pasture or something, and you want to butcher that, but you don't have a place to hang him for bleeding. You've never shot a cow. You've never skinned a cow, or, whatever might be the barrier standing between you and that learning experience. So that's where I want to make this suggestion, which is do half of it. So this is going to answer a couple of the questions you had when we were back and forthing earlier about what we would talk about. So what we've been doing with our larger animals, and I think I would even lump sheep into this. I know they're not that big, but is we know a good butcher, and he does the kill, the skinning, gutting, hanging, and aging, and then we take back the whole animal and we process it ourselves. And the reason I first did that was just because I was trying to learn the whole process backwards. So, you could start by getting a bunch of bulk pieces of pork and then grinding it and making sausage, say. Then you scoot a step back and you process the pig yourself. Then you raise a pig yourself. Then, you know what I mean? Like when I first did this, I wasn't even raising the pigs. I just knew people who are raising pigs. And I said, well, kill me one, but don't process it. And that was a really good way. It's a really good way, I feel like, to dip your toe into the experience without super overwhelming yourself, if that makes sense. Is that tracking?
Yes. Yeah. No, it does make sense, because I feel like with homesteaders especially tend to want to be all or nothing. Like we're so excited.
Right.
We're wanting to jump all the way in. But then, so that prevents us from doing certain things, because it's kind of like, well, if I can't do the whole thing, or I can't do this,
then why would I even? Yeah.
Right. And there's something really nice about pulling that back just to your point. I mean, and also
Right.
with the larger animal, with a cow, especially if you mess that up, that's a huge expense loss versus if you
Oh
mess up
yeah.
butchering one chicken, that, I mean,
Yeah.
yeah, a chicken is a chicken, not to minimize, but that's a very
Yeah.
different financial loss than if you were to completely botch it and lose an
Big
entire
time.
beef. I mean, that's
Yep.
yeah, or even a pig versus a chicken. So,
Oh yeah.
um, I like that this kind of helps it's kind of baby stepping your way,
Exactly.
towards doing everything yourself.
And I'm a huge fan of baby stepping and also working backwards. So going everything that we're trying to do, not you, Melissa, you're exception to this rule, but most of us are first generation and we've, we've not grown up doing this, Melissa. And so
Okay, but hey, actually, here's the funny part. Even being a fifth generation homesteader, we never butchered at home. So that's not something that even
right.
chickens, I did not learn that at home. By the time I came along, we didn't have a milk cow anymore. She was dried up and
Yeah.
lived her life out on the pasture, but we
Yeah.
didn't have a milk cow. Didn't have chickens. We had beef cattle, but my dad didn't butcher any of those. My dad didn't hunt. So I didn't have the experience
Mhm.
even of learning how to cut and wrap from a deer and breaking
Right.
down, deer and venison, which a lot of people do. So there are some things that even being a fifth generation homesteader, I had to
Right.
learn just like everybody else,
And
So
a part of that is infrastructure, structural, cultural, as in, you know, you and I are over here trying to figure out how to can good food and process good sausage, but once upon a time, that's kind of all that was available.
Mhm.
And there were good butchers where you could get things processed. And you weren't, I mean, there's good butchers now, but they're much harder to find. And so a part of it is that push and pull between a lot of homesteaders are trying to do what an entire village once did. And that is overwhelming, especially considering that a lot of us are coming in here, to paraphrase Angelina Stanford when she talks about literature, a lot of us are trying to rebuild the ruins of our homesteading education, which is, oh, here's a button you can get from Amazon to get your toilet paper delivered. What a homemaker. And we're over here saying, but what about aging prosciutto or making bread or canning green beans? These are things that, you're not just trying to learn like one process. You're trying to learn something that is generational wisdom that is very, very layered and often relies on, oh, who's raising your hay? Oh, there's nobody to raise hay, so you're also raising hay. Who's cutting your hay? Oh, nobody has a combine anymore. Oh, you're cutting hay. It's a different world to try to start from scratch. I suppose pulling from the title of your book, but to have to start from scratch a lot of things that once would have been done in community or interdependently with other people.
yeah, no,
So
I
that's
think
where
that's
I felt like doing a piece.
of it. Yeah. Well, it's really true though, because even if you weren't doing it yourself in that context and in the village and historically, you were seeing it done, even if you weren't the one
Mhm.
step by stepping. So it was something that you might not be able to know how to do it, but you had enough knowledge of watching it being done,
Yeah,
that you
you weren't
that you
surprised
could
that a
have.
chicken had to die in order for you to get chicken. You weren't like, "What?"
Right. And so there was like this peripheral knowledge that we don't
Mhm.
have now, or most people don't have now.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I think that's
which is
yeah.
just the even if you're not studying it, and I'm thinking again of it from the literature side, because I just stepped out of our school upstairs and came down here for this. And there's things that are hard to understand without understanding something that stood behind it. And an example of that is Northrop Frye, who famously has his Bible and literature course that he taught, I want to say in Toronto, I'm not sure where. And a bunch of us have been going through the videos together because he was trying to teach literature. So it's like you're trying to teach sausage making, right? He's trying to teach literature or some thing, and people were not understanding because they didn't get the references. They didn't get the clapbacks to biblical characters and things like that. And that's kind of like us a lot of times homesteading. You say, oh, I want to raise a cow. Oh, the beautiful cow on the field. Okay, but do you know about grass days per year and extending grass days per year? And like, there's just a lot of things that we have, so we're all out here reading 100 books and saying, how did our ancestors do this? Well, they, for one, didn't have to do everything. The work was more divided, but also they grew up seeing a lot of things happen. So
yeah.
All that to say, we need to be easy on ourselves a little bit sometimes.
I agree. And so I like this segue. So when you were telling me about this, I'm like, oh, like, okay, I need you to come on because I know people are going to have the same questions that I do.
Yeah.
So let's talk about a little bit, because these are the things that have held us back. So like, let's just start. I just will start there. So what's held us back from processing our beef at home is, one, not having temperatures in our area reliable enough to hang the meat to dry age it. And we don't have a large enough space for the beef for the cold storage. So that, and then equipment, we do have a tractor now. In the past, we didn't. So we could actually hoist up, and it's a large animal to be able to maneuver. So those have been some things, just the sheer size of it, and then the cold storage. So by having the kind of the hybrid model, basically, of what you guys are doing is the mobile butcher comes on site and does those things, and then takes it and does the dry aging hanging process as well.
Yeah, you could do it either way. So we've done the mobile butcher version, and we've also, for the last couple of animals, I've been taking them to this amazing butcher. Can give you his info. I don't know if he wants me to say it on the podcast or not, but he's an amazing butcher, and his farm. I remember when we came back after picking up. There's a cow hide on the couch behind me. We went back to get our cow's hide, and because he let us take everything, and not all butchers will allow that. He basically said, well, what do you want? And I gave him like a long list of organs and things. And he's like, okay, he didn't have a problem with it. And then there's other butchers, like there's one that you and I both used before that just about fell off their chair when I asked for the liver. I was like, okay, it's not really that big of a deal to ask for a liver, but they were like, maybe we can sort of possibly get you the liver, but we don't want to do all these the spleen and all the kidney and all these other things.
Oh, really? So that's super interesting, because I get the lungs, the liver, the tongue.
Yeah.
Like, and they
everything.
Have no problem.
It depends on, I think it depends on who's doing it.
Interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. And then they're even more shocked if I say, they're like, oh, for dog food? I'm like, no, for dinner. And they're like, oh, oh, well. But, anyways, so we've brought animals up there, and after we left, the first time we dropped animals off, my 6-year-old said, that farm is so peaceful. And I was surprised that she noticed it. Well, I shouldn't be surprised, but, then I texted him later and I said what she said, and he said, yeah, we think it's better for the animals. So they like to bring the animals in, let them kind of equalize, get calmed down, get used to a space, and then they do the whole slaughter and hang and everything. So for us, it's fantastic because he also doesn't charge additional. So I want to say getting the cow butchered was like $160 or something. And other butchers don't begrudge this, but other butchers charge double if you're not having them process it, because they make a lot of their money off of the processing.
Yeah.
And if you've ever processed an animal yourself, you know that they're not overcharging you.
Yeah, no, not at all.
Not at all. So I don't begrudge that, but I'm just saying he didn't charge double. Maybe if everybody was doing this, he would have to, but What was your specific question, or what was there a question that led me down this road?
Yeah. No, I think just kind of talking about, I think the steps that hold people back from attempting this
Right.
and
That's
how
right.
you can
Yeah.
use the butcher to kind of mitigate those things that you don't have access to
Yeah.
or that are holding you back to kind of get to that halfway point where most people
Yep.
can. But that leads me into, because even with them butchering it, doing so are you getting it as a half or a quarter broken down?
Well, here's where you asked about. I was thinking about your question where you said, "Is it safe and what kind of space?" That was where I was kind of gonna throw that part down.
Yeah.
So first of all, I would say if you have a big animal that you are raising and you don't have a stock trailer, which we do not have a stock trailer, we hired a guy to drive the animals down, and he was amazing. Like, he's such a great guy. I'm just like, what else can we ship that we can hire him for? He was that cool. And so even if you don't have a trailer, there are people who will do it. Again, it's going to cost you another $100 or something. So your cost, is higher, but, just so that barrier doesn't get in your way. And I say that because sometimes if you're trying to get a mobile butcher, which I'm all about the mobile butchery, but sometimes it's like a year out.
It's 2
And
right now, and it's 2. I just
yeah,
not butchered,
yeah,
booked 2
exactly.
years out our butcher date
And
for
again,
the
that
mobile
comes
butcher.
back to
Yeah.
part of the Yeah, yeah, and that's part of that infrastructure and culturally driven thing where there's not that many people, good luck finding a large animal vet, good luck finding a mobile butcher. These things that used to be more common are now harder to find. And so again, before you beat yourself up about not being able to do this perfect idyllic thing that somebody on Instagram told you is the literally only way to do it, then you can baby step into the program and keep giving custom to these butchers so that their industry stays alive. They can apprentice people and their kids want to join the industry, and you have people to butcher your animals for a long time. So we had our animals driven down to him. Then he did the butcher and the hang, and he aged it in his coolers. And he is all about people learning. So he let me come in and he showed me, oh, this is why I'm taking it down here. Here's what I would look for to tell me if I was going to hang it longer. And he'll hang meat for a long time if the meat is doing well. But you know how some beef just doesn't want to hang more than like 20 days, or
It's
if
usually
it's
my
starting to get
understanding
the
is
mold or whatever.
it's the fat layer. If they have
Yeah.
enough fat,
Yeah.
then they can hang
Yeah.
longer. Yeah.
Yeah. And our beef was pretty lean. So I think he hung it for like 22 days or something. And then he said it was starting to get like moldy at the top, which is where you want to shave that off. So
Right.
he offered that we could take home a portion at a time and he could leave the rest in his freezer or his cooler. So I don't know if all butchers would do that, but it's worth asking.
Probably not. It
We
probably
took
depends on
it.
how
Yeah.
busy.
Yeah.
Yeah, how busy they are and how
Yeah.
much space they've got in
That's what
the
he said. He said,
area.
I've
Yeah.
got a lot of room. I can leave it hanging in the back. It's out of the way. We also had a small as Angus Jersey cross. So he was like 600 pounds hanging. It was not like that big. So I said, just give it to us, the whole thing at once. And then I was just going to get it in the back of the vehicle I thought just big pieces. But he offered, do you want me to break it down, because at least into primals for you? And I was like, sure, I guess, why not? You're offering, you have the saw thingy. But we'll get to the saw thingy when we get to the tools part. But that you can ask a butcher if they'll do such things or not, and you can ask around to different butchers and find out. We were willing to do just hang it and take the whole thing home as 2 big slabs, but we didn't end up having to do that with this particular beef. So did that answer that question? No, I need to be writing down the questions as we go.
Yeah. So basically, though, back to the space needed is going to depend on how much you can get it broken down from the butcher.
Yeah. Yeah.
So just thinking like I mean, if it's broken down as a half an animal, that is still massive. Like you are going to need a really big cut area. If it's
Yeah.
then, quartered and then to primal cuts, then obviously that
Well,
would be like a big
depending.
island or whatnot
Yeah. Depending on the size of the cow you're butchering. So if you
itself.
had
Yeah.
like a 1,300-pound limousine or something, maybe, probably a lot of us are doing dairy crosses, since that's where a lot of people's extra beef cows come from. It's like she had to get pregnant, so which is helpful because those are smaller. But the way that we handled keeping things cold was because now that you've dried this beef, you don't want to just dump bags of ice on top of it. So we have a bunch of coolers. I got them from the Pickers store in Arlington. Have you ever been there? Shane's store?
Yes. Yeah. I've been there just once or twice. Yeah.
Yeah. So I'm just like, give me old coolers. I don't care if the lids are attached. I can just set it on top. They don't have to look nice. And I put ice in the bottom and then plastic. Like I bought like sheet plastic and then laid the beef on top of that. So it was cold from the bottom up, but it wasn't getting saturated by dripping water, if that makes sense. And then we just start working really fast. We just go as fast as we can. And I don't know. I shouldn't jump ahead to that question. Keep going with your questions.
Yeah.
I'll slow down.
Okay. No. So are you guys doing it outside? Are you doing it inside? Like, paint me a picture of the actual space that you're doing it. And then in that space, kind of what are your preferred must-have tools, in order to do it?
Preferred tools.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. So a lot would depend on the season you're doing it in, like what time of year it is probably, and what your tolerance is for weather, I guess. You alluded to our unpredictable weather, which is so accurate. It could be 70 degrees randomly in winter. And also it gets down to 50 in July. So it's like, so you just don't know what to expect. So that's part of the reason why we went and found this guy, because we cannot hang meat in this weather. And then it randomly is getting up to, even when we're trying to do it in fall, then you look at the weather and you say, well, you got 8 days of cold. And then randomly there's a warm snap in the middle of that. So, what I have done, we did some outside. Now we do them inside because it's more controlled. So you don't have dogs walking up, you don't have cats, we have outdoor animals. And so I wanted to be able to control the situation. So we've used our back balcony where animals can't get to. And then mostly we do it inside because it's just, to me, it feels cleaner or something.
There's not as much fly issue. Yeah.
Yeah. You don't have wasps coming and eating. Like the first time I did a pig, the wasps were like gobbling up the meat as fast as I could package it. I was like, this is not ideal. So what we do is we basically want to prepare for this day. And you make sure you have all your supplies, which we'll get to, in hand before you start, if you can. And then we bring in a bunch of folding tables, and the same ones that we use for the chickens. So Gary sanitizes them and sets them up. And then we also have a big wooden kitchen table that we use to pile things on. And then our back balcony, since it's elevated and away from any possible animal invaders, I line up the coolers on the back balcony. It also stays really cool all the time. So that's great. And we have 3 refrigerators and 4 chest freezers, much to the detriment of our solar panel system. But those are what we use to keep things cold. And then I store have you been to Bellingham Costco? They sell bags of ice there, 20 pounds for $2.49 or something. So if you need a ton of ice, I know it's so cheap to get a ton of ice there. So I get a ton of ice in advance. And then actually when I pick up the beef, if you're wondering where one puts this much meat in one's vehicle, I got shower curtains and I laid a shower curtain down. And then actually a couple times I've gotten, have you seen those bags that people put mattresses in at Lowe's? So I get those bags because then I can cover it and roll it under itself and it's completely encased. And then I heap ice on top of it. So it would be fine for the home, but just, I guess, for my peace of mind, then it stays cold that entire transport. So shower curtains and or mattress bags for transporting. And I guess if you had a bunch of sheet plastic from something else, that would work too. But that's what we found. I've done it in the pickup truck and I've done it in the back of my Yukon. So it was really fun though, Melissa, because I stopped at the Costco to get more ice on my way home the last time I picked it up, and I opened up the back of the car and people were literally stopping, driving by. They're like, what is in the back of your car? Like, it's a cow. It's fine. So big tables, lots of tables. And then for tools, we started very minimal. And every year we've basically used the budget that we would have spent on processing to buy tools. So technically we're not staying far below budget, but we have now accumulated tools that will get return on investment over ensuing years, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So the most important thing, and I'll give you links to these things, Melissa, that you can put somewhere.
We'll put it in
for people to download.
Yeah, that accompanies this
okay,
episode.
Perfect.
Yeah,
perfect. Put it in a place. So my personal favorite tool is a big, like a long machete almost style looking knife, and a breaking knife and a boning knife. You pretty much can do everything with those. The only thing you can't do is cut bone. And I did not have a bone saw the first time I did a pig. I used a good old tree saw to cut. But there's ways of processing pigs that you're cutting. I think I only had to cut 2 places per side for bone. So there's, historically, people have had to figure out how to work around bones and things like that without having big radial arm saws or whatever the heck people use, the big saws they have at the butcher place. And you can work around most of the joints and things. The hardest things would be like long femur bones or something, or big rib cages or spines. And when you're doing a pig, that's not even that much of a problem. A lot of what you can do just use leverage to break it. But I do have a bone saw now, and I love it. It's such a flex to have a bone saw, Melissa. They're not that expensive. I'm pretty sure ours was under $100. And once you have it, you have it. I've now used it for 4 years. So I've got my return back on that bad boy. And with a boning knife, you can do pretty much an entire animal. Like, it's just a question of how you use it. Mm-hmm. And then you want tubs and tubs and bowls and bowls. And you can never have enough tubs. You can never have enough bowls. I didn't have bussing tubs the first time. I just had every soup pot and mixing bowl that I owned, and every giant Tupperware that I owned. Now I have dedicated bussing tubs that we use exclusively for butchering, but we just accumulated a few every year, so the cost wasn't insane. But most restaurant supply stores, if you have what is it called right now? Chef's Store / Us Foods, or Dick's Restaurant Supply, or Bar Green Ellingson, any of those kinds of stores will have bussing tubs, and you can get some with lids, you can get some without lids. We have a variety. Then we have a variety of sizes that we use things for. Some of them we use for marinating things in, or some we use for mixing spices or whatever. So tubs, totes, a couple knives. I'll post links to my favorite ones. I'll send it
Okay.
to you, Melissa. And some big cutting boards. It's really helpful. Again, we didn't really have any of that when we started, but we just used our savings towards a little bit every year, adding on. Aprons. If you can get like a waterproof apron, that's nice.
The kind
Whatever
that
you
can
use
hose.
for doing
Those are
chickens.
helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Whatever you use for doing chickens. We always
You want
wear
to know what
gloves.
I actually use for doing chickens is the
No.
Grunder's overalls.
Oh,
They
perfect.
were great because it comes up like, right? Like it comes to
Yeah.
here and they're
Yeah.
suspendered on and then it goes all the way
Yeah.
down because it's
All
pants
the way down.
and you can just hose them off. Like
That would work.
Yeah, they work
That would work.
fabulous. Yeah.
We'll just start a new trend like butcher style or something.
Yeah. Yeah. Just wear overalls.
Outfit of the day.
Yeah.
Rubber aprons and overalls.
Yep.
So we wear gloves when we work with our meat. That would be a personal preference thing for people. And things we have added that are more gadgety, we've added a meat grinder. So we did not have a grinder when we started. So we just thought about ground meat. We're like, oh, remember ground meat? How nice was that? We just didn't have any for a while. Gary found one on Facebook Marketplace and he was like, oh, look, this is $200 brand new. And I was like, take money, go run, drive, wherever it is, go get it. But even at full cost, they're still worth it. It's so nice to have ground meat. And, you know, since we're grinding it, we can grind in our preference of spices. We grind in organs. We grind in fat if we want to have them fatty. And then you can package it however works for your family, which we'll get to packaging at the end. And so what else is some of my favorites? Let me jump back to my list over here. Okay.
Yeah. So I think
for packaging, we'll get to that at the end. No, what were you going to say?
Well, I think one of the things that really holds up a lot of folks, and I would even include myself in this, is knowing the anatomy and how and where to make your cuts.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
One, like you get the most use out of it, but secondly, that you're getting all of the cuts that you want.
Yeah.
And like learning that process.
Yes. Okay. So
yeah,
that is probably the piece that has taken us the most to learn. And your specific question you asked me was, let's see, is it difficult to learn? And my note says define difficult / it depends on what you want to do. So we love a challenge. So we enjoy trying to find, oh, what's this specific part? However, a lot of it is very recognizable. Okay. But you have to also bear in mind different breeds of animals, different sizes of animals, different methods of feeding animals. They all come out looking different. So it's not just like a haunch is a haunch is a haunch. They can look very different. And you asked about how we learned.
Yeah.
Seriously. We did
trial and error
books, but honestly, YouTube.
Okay.
For one, it's free. And for two, we would watch multiple videos of people breaking down the same piece of a cow, and every single one would look different. And so that gave us some exposure to the variety that we might encounter. And then also, some guys go really fast. Some guys go slower. The amount of times we have paused, okay, cut, okay, play, pause, okay, cut, trying to find things on animals is quite entertaining, actually. And our kids love it because they sit and watch it's like, oh, mom and dad are watching TV, basically. So they sit and watch it with us and they help us. They put gloves on and they work too. That's a fun thing, is getting your kids involved if your kids are at all into it. And we just watched tons and tons and tons of video. And I know people will ask which ones were the best. And I can send you some links to some that we liked. But really, I think it comes down to your personal style. There are people who trim off a lot. And then there's people who like chewy cuts, and then there's people who are like, oh, we're going to cut in this Italian style, or we're going to do this different style, or our customers really like roast, so we're going to cut, so you just basically watch tons of YouTube and that was how we learned. And the books were more handy when we wanted to pull out specific recipes. And then we interviewed on our podcast, Melissa, and she's a butcher that is really good at curing and things like that. And I got her book, I think it's called Ethical Meat Butchery. What is it called? Ethical Meat Handbook. Ethical Meat Handbook. And that's a really, really beautiful book if somebody wants an exposure to lots of different information on butchery, but you don't want to be on YouTube or whatever. Bearded Butchers was one we watched a ton of their videos, and we would also watch them and I'd be like, okay, Gary, he did that in 8 minutes. And then 2 hours later, we're like, okay.
2 hours versus 8. Yes.
Yeah. It gives you real respect for the craft. I mean, this is something people devoted their lives to. We're talking about trying to learn something that somebody's entire life is dedicated to learning and apprenticing. And then, there's no way we're going to compete with that kind of knowledge. But this past year was the first year that we did like sausage stuffing. So we used casings this past year. And it was the first year we did all these mixed ground meats. No, we did grinds before. We just didn't stuff them. But we've gotten more adventurous every time. And I would caution somebody to not start out thinking their pig's going to end up looking like if they got it back from a professional butcher who's been doing this for 30 years, because it's going to look like you did it yourself after 20 hours of YouTube. But that's how you learn. And now we've got these really delicious breakfast sausages, and we mixed in blueberries and maple syrup and spices and essential oils and all kinds of stuff. Like, you can do that when you're making your own. And that has been a really fun learning process, but it's not where we started. Like, we started with basically we're going to have pork roasts all year, learning. And then another thing that we've done for our own education, Melissa, what I really want to see is you and Gary butchering something together, because I feel like I would just be rolling around laughing the whole time. You guys would be like prime entertainment. I'll just video it and we'll put it on your YouTube and it will get 1 million hits. But that would be so entertaining. But Gary will look for a specific cut in a piece that we're planning to turn, say, into ground beef. Because at the end of the day, as long as you get the meat package, there's no loss. Maybe you don't get your French cut pork roast, but you get sausage. I mean, so he French cut the ribs or whatever it's called. Like, we would just try all kinds of different cuts and we're like, hey, it looks pretty good. Okay, throw it in the grinder, and then if it looks really nice, maybe we'd keep it as it was. But it was a way for us to learn with zero loss, because at the end of the day, the meat's all good, even if it's different shape. And like, we've not had a bad piece of meat, yet.
So how long do you think it takes and I get, kind of, if it's changed from when you started to now, how long do you feel like it takes you to do a cow? Like, how long is the process basically from start to finish?
Okay, well, that's going to depend on the size. Okay, so the things that will factor into this, depending on how fast you're trying to go, the size of the animal, because I've had pigs that were bigger than the cow, and then what you're making. So if you're just going to grind it all up, or you're just going to make a 50 roast, that's different than if you want to make a bunch of New York steaks, which we did. I basically lived on those for my postpartum. I was like, I'll have steak again for breakfast, thank you. But the other things that will factor in is like if you have people helping you. So we did you and I did an episode on the working bees before, and we've only ever done it as a family. We've never had people. No, that's not true. Jeremy helped me the first pig I did. So, but that was only two. I did most of that pig on my own, and then Jeremy came at the end and helped me out. But we've only done it as a family, and we've discussed, hey, if we wanted to do a bigger cow, X number of people and how long it would take. So I would say processing and packaging everything took us 2 days. But then on the backside of that, there's more that has to happen. Like, if you're labeling things, I'm mainly the labeler and packager. So as fast as Gary cuts things, I try to get them all packaged away. And we got almost the entire cow done in about 2 days. But then I still felt like there was things that, I forgot that there's a basin of, cut ribs or something. And then I processed the broth. It took me like another 4 days. Cause I was like, there's no room for bones. We're just cooking it all. So the bones I just kept in the coolers with the ice. At that point, I didn't care if they got wet. They didn't, but I didn't care if they did. And then the fat took me much longer to process. So the meat, pretty quick. Everything else kind of depends on your goal. If there was a couple of us hanging out processing broth, which, was kind of slow anyways, but then helping me can it or something, and I wasn't like spending half of the day throwing up in the bathroom from pregnancy, probably would have been faster. And then we also had the unique crunch of Gary had 2 days off of work. So we had to fit it all in those 2 days. And then he went back to work. And then I was like, finish the cow.
Lovely.
Does that answer that question?
Yeah.
Highly variable. Highly variable.
But I think that's a good point, because when you're processing it all, you actually have more bones than what you normally would get back from the butcher. Like we specifically ask our butcher, like, we want the femur bones. Most people don't ask for those. Most people will get some soup bones, if that, but they don't ask for the femur bones. They don't ask for all those bones. So we do. So but you're dealing with all of that when you're butchering it yourself. So you have the excess bones, and to your point, you have the excess fat. So are you going to render it down, or are you just going to package that fat up, put it in the freezer until you can render it down later? But those are all things that, right. But it has to be dealt with. Yeah. When you're doing it. So there's those other pieces beyond just, expecting to kind of cut up and have the same volume that you would get when you pick it up from the butcher. You're going to have a larger volume of stuff to deal with. Oh yeah. Because that's a lot of stuff that the butcher typically keeps, because most people don't want, and they're dealing with. So I think that's good to know that. So, and you have all those like fascia pieces, stuff like that to cope with, which our dogs love, FYI. So let's talk a little bit about process of packaging up the meat, that type of thing. And then with those leftover meat scraps as well, like, are you guys just grinding all of that, or kind of what's your process there? Yeah. Okay. So packaging, we've done a variety of methods. The first year, I just had a giant roll of brown paper, and I was just rolling stuff up, tying it with string and writing on it. That was how that happened. Not my favorite method. What we did this past year was we got an industrial vacuum sealer. So we've been vacuum sealing things, which I feel like is better. So again, it would depend on what tools you have. We didn't have a vacuum sealer when we started. And so I wrapped it in paper. And you can get paper very cheaply at the restaurant supply, and a roll of butcher string, and you can wrap your meat up that way if you want to. So our process is typically how we have all the tables set up. Gary kind of knows what he wants, cuts he wants. I tell him I at least want X pounds of ground. I at least want X pounds of stew. And so then that kind of drives some of his decisions. And then also we're totally open to, oh, look, this looks like a really good roast. Let's just keep it as a roast then. So we get that flexibility. Or he'll try, like he was trying to get certain cuts of steaks for a while until they got perfect. And then the other ones just got ground up, and then some looked really good. So we kept way more steaks than we were expecting to, but that worked out for me, as we have learned. So I vacuum seal it. I've just been writing on labels. We've done some printed labels. If there's something, there's a million of like ground sausage or something, I just print off a label so I don't have to write all those. But then for all the things where there's 5 of this and 6 of that, I'm just writing it by hand. And we put the name of the animal on the package so we know when we eat it
And then when we say our prayer for our meal, the kids always say, "Oh, and thank you for Chuck who, gave his life for this meal," or whatever. And then as I'm doing it, I'm also filling out an Excel spreadsheet so I can look and see how many pounds of X things or bones or whatever, which is also nice because then I calculate how much each pound cost.
Yeah.
Which is nice to know sometimes. Sometimes not nice to know.
Sometimes you're not happy when you get that total back. Yeah.
Like, oh wow. And then I pack it all in the freezer. So Gary's cutting basically the entire time. I'm packaging, labeling, and freezing, packaging, labeling, and freezing, packaging. And we go until, like, we did almost the entire cow the first day. The second day was mainly grinding and cutting the stew beef because Gary trims it all on the spot. So then when I open a stew beef package, I don't have to trim it. So we went until like 3:00 in the morning or something, but that's just because you've got everything's out, everything's greasy, the fat, you have to package everything back up and sanitize everything in order to start again the next day. And we're like, no, we're just going to keep going. We're just going to keep going. So I don't know if that's anybody's vibe, but if it is, then that's one way to do it.
It's an all-nighter.
Yeah. If you had more people, then it wouldn't be. If I wasn't so pregnant and sick, maybe it would have been. I just felt like I would have to sit down a lot of the time because I just feel like woozy. So probably we'd be faster if we did one now, even though we have a baby now, because I felt like I was working at 25% my capacity.
Oh, yeah.
But I got a cute baby out of it, so I can't complain.
Yeah. So what, like with the leftover meat scraps, like
Mhm.
like this, like the fascia and different things like that typically aren't, necessarily being ground into.
Yeah.
How much of that did you really have, and what was your process for dealing with that part?
I don't think I kept track of that, but I will say it was about a bussing tub that we
Okay.
felt like was not usable. Because when you're cutting through, you'll find some glands and things that, again, never come back to you after the butcher. And we just cut all that out and we make dog food out of it. So before, we've ground it up and then packaged little packages that we can use as like a dog treat. This time we just gave them a little piece at a time, and they don't care if it's ground up or not. They're happy.
No. Yeah.
And then for the broth, pro tip, if you have a turkey roaster, which I'm all about the turkey roasters, take the inside of the turkey out like that liner, and it fits across 2 burners on your stove. Fill it up with bones and cover it with water. And I threw in tons of herbs and just covered it up. And I would got 4 burners, and 2 turkey roasters. So I would do 2 turkey roasting pans, bowls. I don't know how that grammar works. And cook it overnight. And then the next morning, strain it out, start it again. And you can get every 12 hours, basically a batch done. And it holds those big bones, some of them are kind of poking out,
Right.
But when Gary, Ernie cut most of the big cuts, like the pieces. Gary was like, oh, I wanted to do those. But I was like, sorry, I didn't know what to tell him. But Gary, you can cut up bones with a bone saw. So like we cut, what's it called? Ossobuco, when you have like the big piece of meat with the bone in the middle. Mm-hmm. And so Gary cut those bones literally with the bone saw. I mean, it's a big round bone, but he cut it with the bone saw. So it is possible. And in some instances preferable, because the problem with those, I think called like butcher boys or something, those big blades that they use, bandsaw type thing, they heat the area around the bone. There's a lot of friction going through the meat, and then they also cause bone fragments to kind of burst out. So we would find, like, you have to clean them. There's bone scrapers you can use, like bone fragment scrapers you use to scrape the meat, but because we mostly cut the bones ourselves, we don't have that problem.
Oh, nice. Okay.
Yeah. And then just can all the broth as per Melissa's instructions. Go get her book.
Thank you. Yeah. Um, yeah. So do you feel like with the amount of work and equipment investment, though I know you said like you start out really minimal and then each year just
Yeah.
invest, like when the amount saved per pound package and wrapping that you would pay at the butcher to do it versus the time investment and equipment investment on your end, like, do you really feel like it's a cost saving, or is it more we're acquiring this skill set in combination with that?
Just from the money side, I've calculated that we've saved thousands of dollars.
Okay.
So just in money, even with the money we spent on equipment. And there's still more toys that we want to get. And then you do have to factor in that you're buying bags or paper or whatever you're wrapping it with. And then string or casings or salt or whatever if you're curing things. But even then, we've still definitely saved thousands of dollars. And then for us, we have this sort of non-quantifiable satisfaction, I guess, that comes from doing something ourselves and knowing the process and feeling confident that now, we're to the point where, okay, the only thing we haven't done is the slaughter and the hanging. So by the time we get to that point where we have a space where we can hang it and age it, it won't be that big of a leap for us. It won't be this all-consuming, overwhelming, unexpected sort of thing.
Right.
Just adding on one new layer. So yes, definitely savings.
Okay, awesome. Because I mean, honestly, like that's part of the thing, you have to take it into consideration and wonder about it. And to the point, there are some things.
You could even do half. You could to process half of it and do all the ground meat for you. And then you could take home half of it and do cuts yourself. You really, theoretically, you can go as low and slow as you want. You could even say, just give me these 2 primal cuts back and I'll process them myself. And, you don't have to start with the whole cow.
Bringing the whole animal back.
Yeah. It's fun.
Awesome.
I mean, it's really fun. And it kind of makes me just want to cook some giant, enormous piece of meat whenever I see I just want to put that over a fire and roast it.
Okay. I find that funny because I have to say on poultry harvesting day, I don't want to eat poultry that night for dinner. Like, I'm like, give me beef, or give me pork. I am not eating chicken for dinner the day we butcher chickens, but maybe I'm weird. I don't know. So I find that funny because
I was sitting last year, very pregnant, very cold, soaking wet in an apron with a pile of gizzards on my lap, cleaning them. And I was like, Gary, this is making me so hungry. I want gizzards. And I was like, that probably sounds really weird. But it was making, I don't know, it was making me hungry. I was like, gizzards,
like you were ready to go
right now.
for it. Okay, that's funny. I love it. Yeah. So on beef butchering day, you're like, no, beef for dinner. I'm good.
Yeah, and beef is even more appealing to look at than like raw chicken. Beef is just...
I do agree with that statement. Yes.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And we did have, it was my 6-year-old's beef cow. What do you call it? I mean, it's not a cow. It was a bull. I mean, not a bull. It was a steer. So it was her beef steer that we butchered. And she loved that steer. It was her baby and everything. So we made it a real process. Like, we went down and we told every day he's going to get picked up. This is what's going to happen. And then the day he was going to get picked up, I walked down with her. I was like, let's just go down and see him one more time. And she goes down. She has her little purse on her shoulder, which I thought was cute. And then when we got down there, she opened the purse and took out a piece of paper, and she sits down and shows the steer. It was a picture of him in the grass with his mother, our dairy cow, and his sister, our dairy heifer, and a bull that she imagined to be his father. She's like, look, Chuck, it's you in heaven. This is where you're going to be. And I was like, oh my gosh. And she was instead of coming away traumatized from the experience, having something she loved butchered and now feeding all of us for the year, she came away with more of the attitude, this is my body broken for you. Take, eat in remembrance of me. And whenever we eat the beef, she goes, oh, thank you, Chuck. Oh, Chuck loves me because he's making me strong and healthy. I'm like, wow, I love the way she translated that. So it's such a good all around experience. And then when all the beef showed up, for her to get to put her hands on it and process it, this is his heart. And she's like, she kissed it. She's like, I love it because it's his heart. And then eating it, she was, when I cooked the beef, she's the first person I served. I was like, okay, I'm going to serve you your beef. And she's just so happy about it. So I was very concerned that we made it a good experience for her because of how much she loved that steer. And I think at the end of the day, it was. And hopefully, because I've heard of lots of farm kids who are adults now who don't eat meat because they're like, yeah, I raised an animal, I loved it, and then they killed it. I didn't want that to be her experience. And I'm really happy that I think it wasn't. And I'm glad that we got to spend all the time processing it literally and metaphorically with her.
Yeah. It's really interesting because my kids have never been traumatized by it, but it's also been something they've always been aware of. Like there was never this hiding factor. Like I've heard stories where people are like, oh, that their parents told them the animal was going to the zoo on Butcher Day, and then they would go to the zoo and think it was there. Like so anyways, and then they found out later. And so like we've just always been very upfront about it. And what I find interesting though is my children's emotional attachment to animals and care for their well-being, even though they know that it's going to be something that we're going to be butchering down the road. They have immense empathy and treat those animals so incredibly well.
So good.
And I think that there's something about us seeing it being a real sacrifice. Because when you have that emotional attachment to that animal, you do want to make sure nothing goes to waste. And there is an emotional aspect that happens that sadly, if you've never went through that experience, like it's really hard for me to articulate it to someone who's never went through that.
Yeah.
But it's something that's really special and not easy. Like I butchered slaughter day, kill day, butchered it, harvest day, whatever word you want to use.
Yeah.
For me, every year it becomes more impactful and I'm actually more emotional. In a good way, but in a very aware way of what sacrifice actually means. And for there to be life, there is death. And I feel like we live in a society that very much wants to separate that and really wants to make, like we don't talk about death. We don't deal with grief. I think it's something beautiful, but I think it's also something as a Western society, we try to separate out death. We try to avoid death. We don't talk about death. And so you can't have life without death. And I think for me, being part of that process really brings that home as a Christian, especially what true sacrifice is, and what truly Jesus did on the cross with his sacrifice for us. And so it becomes this really, just this very emotional and impactful, quite a profound moment and day for me on the actual Butcher Day. And I feel like it's something that we very much in Western society have actually lost. And so I think it's really important and a beautiful, though hard thing at the same time. But one I'm glad that my children do have that experience.
Yeah. I agree because it really does feel when instead of hiding from the fact that somebody you loved and something that was beloved died in order that you could get the world's most optimal nutrition for your body, I feel like accepting it and saying, whenever you eat this bread and drink this cup, remember the Lord's death until he comes sort of attitude when you sit down to eat these meals. To me, that feels, like you've got the gospel at every meal, and there's no hiding from it, and there's no denial that you can't exist without somebody sacrificing for you. And it does produce really good meat, so
it does.
That.
Yes. Yeah. Well, Andrea, this has been delightful. I always enjoy any time that we get to talk and to visit. So for those that this is their, it's always fun. For those who may be coming upon you for the first time, we'll definitely link to the prior episode that we did on the working bee. I got so many people responded and commented, really loved that episode. So if you've not listened to it, highly recommend going and listening to that. But where is the best place for folks to connect with you here online?
Well, I'm really not on social media at all. I have an Instagram, Farm and Hearth, but I haven't been on it really much lately. And probably the best thing is, I guess, find me on the podcast, Ancestral Kitchen. That's where most of my energy is going in terms of online things.
Perfect. Well, we'll make sure. Okay, great. We will have that linked in the blog post and show notes. So well, awesome. And cool. Are you guys butchering again this year, or did you already? Because you were pregnant. So
yeah, we did a bunch of birds, but we're not really
beef right now.
I didn't know what to expect. You don't know if you'll get one of those babies that cries all the time or one of those babies that sleeps all the time. I got one of the babies that sleeps like really well, so it's great, but how was I supposed to know? So I didn't raise anything intentional for this year.
Okay, awesome. Well, then that means next year we will get together and get one of those videos. Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. Awesome.
Let's do it.
Okay.
Good to see you, Melissa.
Yeah. Thank you so much for coming on. Well, I hope that you enjoyed that as much as I did. You can go to the blog post that has all of the awesome things that Andrea was talking about, including her PDF checklist, supplies, as well as different resources and past episodes along this topic. You want to go to melissaknorris.com/445 because this is episode number 445. That is a lot of episodes, y'all. Thank you so much for joining me, and I look forward to being back here with you next week. Blessings and mason jars for now, my friends.